Night descended on the city, shrouding it in a thick fog. The streets were empty, the lanterns flickering as if afraid to illuminate the darkness that crept up from the outskirts. In the heart of the old neighborhood stood a mansion that had long been considered cursed. No one dared to approach it after sunset, but this night its doors were to be opened again. Artyom clutched the heavy iron key in his hand, the coldness of it chilling him to the bone. He stood in front of the mansion's massive door, feeling his heart beating faster. Beside him were two friends, Dima and Natasha. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" Natasha whispered, wrapping her arms around herself. "It's too late to back out now," Dima replied hoarsely, looking around. Artyom took a deep breath and inserted the key into the keyhole. The lock gave in with a muffled click, and the door slowly swung open, letting out the musty smell of centuries-old dust and something metallic. They stepped inside. The light of the lanterns revealed ancient furniture covered in a thick layer of dust and paintings that smelled ominous. But what caught their attention most of all was the huge portrait hanging over the fireplace. It showed a man with piercing scarlet eyes that seemed to follow the guests' every move. "It's him," Artyom whispered. "Grigory Chernyshev." "The one?" Natasha bit her lip. "Yes, the last owner of this house. They say he was into forbidden things." "Black magic?" Dima grinned, but there was tension in his voice. "Blood rituals," Artyom corrected him, "and they say his spirit is still here." As if in response to his words, something creaked on the second floor. The friends froze. "It's the wind," Dima said hastily, but no one believed him. Artyom pointed the flashlight toward the stairs. The dark steps leading upstairs seemed to beckon them. "We need to check it out," he said firmly. "Why?" Natasha whispered. "Because I need to know the truth." Without waiting for their answer, Artyom took the first step up. The creaking of the boards under his feet sounded deafening in the silence. Dima and Natasha glanced at each other, but followed him. When they reached the second floor, the air around them became heavier. A faint odor of blood was coming from somewhere. There were doors along the corridor, but one was ajar. "This is it," Artyom exhaled. He pushed the door open, and it creaked open with a long creak. Inside was a room illuminated by moonlight coming through a broken window. In the middle of the room stood an old oak table, and on it, God! Natasha covered her mouth with her hand in horror. There was a book on the table, its pages scribbled with bloody symbols. But the worst was ahead. The book suddenly moved. A thick, dark liquid slowly began to seep out of its pages. Droplets fell onto the table, and then began to collect into words. "Blood remembers, blood calls, blood demands." At that moment, there was the sound of footsteps behind them, heavy, unnatural. The friends turned around and froze in horror. A shadow stood at the end of the hallway, tall, with burning scarlet eyes. It took a step toward them. The flashlight in Artyom's hand began to flicker, glinting faintly in the darkness. The scarlet eyes at the end of the corridor burned like glowing embers. The figure took another step forward. "Run!" Natasha shouted, grabbing Dima's arm. But Artyom stood still. His gaze was fixed on the book lying on the table. Droplets of blood continued to drip from its pages, forming new words. "You have come. The blood knows you. The blood will accept you." "Artyom, let's go," Dima shouted, tugging him by the shoulder. But it was too late. Cold fingers clenched his wrist. Artyom flinched and turned around. A man stood in front of him, or rather, what had once been a man. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his lips were cracked and dry, like a long-dead corpse. He was dressed in an ancient black suit, and a long, stale wound was visible on his neck, as if his throat had once been attempted to be slit. "You, who?" Artyom squeezed out, feeling an icy fear gripping his body. The creature bowed its head slightly. "I am the owner of this house." The voice was deep, as if coming from the bottom of the grave. "You came to me, then you already know who you are." "What?" Artyom could hardly breathe. "You came to your blood." The shadow took another step forward, "and your blood is calling you." At that moment, Natasha screamed. The shadows in the corners of the room stirred. They stretched out, wriggling as if alive. Dima grabbed her arm and rushed to the exit, but the door slammed shut on its own. "Oh my God, we're locked in." The creature slowly raised its hand, and Artyom felt his body paralyzed. "The book has been waiting for you. You know what to do." Artyom looked again at the bloody words on the pages. Suddenly he realized that they began to change. as if they were waiting for his realization. Accept, open, become. Suddenly, images flashed before his eyes. Blood, rituals, sacrifices, and among them he saw himself. But not here, not in this time. He was standing in this same mansion, but many years ago. The people in black robes surrounding him were whispering something in an ancient language. Artyom looked at his hands. They were stained with blood. His blood was part of this place. No, he whispered, coming back to reality. Yes, the creature said, sliding its fingers across his cheek. Blood always comes home. At that moment, the book flashed with red light. The walls shook. Voices began to echo through the room. Natasha and Dima huddled together, watching as shadows began to gather around Artyom. Artyom, please wake up, Natasha shouted. But he couldn't hear her anymore. All he could hear was the call of blood. The book glowed with scarlet light, and the voices grew louder, filling the room with ominous whispers. Artyom froze, his gaze fixed on the words, which kept changing their shape. Now they were forming into something frightening. The time has come. Accept your fate. Shadows clenched around him, cold like ghostly hands touching his skin. Natasha and Dima watched in horror as their friend gradually disappeared in the bloody glow of the book. No, Natasha screamed, rushing toward him. But an invisible force threw her back. Dima managed to pick her up, but at that moment he felt the air in the room become heavy with the odor of metal and rotting flesh. The creature standing in front of Artyom smiled. You're ready, it whispered, and its icy fingers touched the boy's chest. Artyom shuddered. Images of the past flashed before his eyes again. Dark rituals, sacrifices, people bowing before him in awe. He was standing on a stone altar, the same ancient volume in his hands. Blood flowed down the steps, soaking into the stone, infusing it with power. He wasn't just a part of this house. He was its heir. He was the one who must continue the ritual. Artyom clamped his eyes shut, trying desperately to resist, but the voice inside him was insistent. You must remember, your blood knows the truth. And he remembered. His real name was Grigory Chernyshev. He did not die. He was reborn. God, he whispered as reality came over him in a wave of horror. Now you understand. The creature smiled. You can't run away from your blood. Artyom raised his eyes to his friends. Natasha looked at him with despair, her eyes begging him to fight. Dima clenched his fists, but didn't move, afraid of doing something wrong. And then Artyom made a decision. He abruptly grabbed the book and squeezed it in his hands. Its pages lit up. The bloody light flashed like fire. The voices around him howled. The figure in front of him froze. What are you doing? The creature bellowed. Finishing this. Blood ran down his hands, but he didn't stop. He recited the ancient words that suddenly appeared in his mind. It was a ritual, not for awakening, but for sealing. The creature howled. The shadows began to fade. The walls of the mansion trembled, and the air was filled with a crackling sound, as if space itself was beginning to collapse. Artyom, Natasha shouted. He turned to his friends, his eyes now glowing scarlet too, but there was determination in them. Go away, now. And you? Dima stepped toward him, but Artyom could no longer hear them. The last words escaped his lips, and the next moment the world around them exploded with red light. When Natasha and Dima woke up, they were lying in the street. In front of them was a wasteland. The mansion had disappeared. Where's Artyom? Natasha wheezed, looking around in panic. But he was nowhere to be found. Only the slight odor of blood hung in the air. And from far away came a whisper, barely audible but still alive. Blood remembers, blood calls, blood demands. The cold wind blew across the vacant lot where the ominous mansion had recently stood. Natasha and Dima struggled to get up, their bodies aching as if they had fallen from a great height. They looked around, there were only dry trees and cracked earth. Where is the mansion? Natasha looked at Dima. It's gone, he exhaled. And Artyom. His voice trailed off. They both knew the answer. Artyom was still there, in that cursed place, part of something ancient, something that should never have awakened. But suddenly the air thickened again. Do you hear that? Natasha tensed, listening. A muffled whisper echoed across the wasteland. The blood remembers. Blood calls. The ground shook, and a dark shadow slowly began to appear in the center of the wasteland. It stretched out, spiraling as if something was sneaking out. Run! Natasha shouted. grabbing Dima's hand. They ran without looking back, through the forest, breaking through branches and bushes. Their hearts were pounding frantically, but the whispering didn't fade. Blood demands. Suddenly, Dima stumbled and collapsed to the ground. Natasha stopped abruptly, helping him up, but his eyes widened in horror. Natasha, your hand. She looked down and froze. There were bloody symbols on her palm, the same ones that had been in Artyom's book. The wind died down. The forest became too quiet. And suddenly, right in front of them, a silhouette began to loom in the air. A tall figure in black, with scarlet eyes. No, Natasha whispered. The figure took a step forward. The blood remembers, and it's coming back for you. Darkness closed in around them. The darkness enveloped Natasha and Dima, the cold piercing them to the bone. The figure in black took another step forward, its scarlet eyes glowing in the night. No, Natasha whispered, backing away. Dima squeezed her hand, trying to keep himself from panicking. They both knew who it was. Artyom. But was he still himself? Are you alive? Dima's voice trembled. Artyom tilted his head, steadying them. His facial features were the same, but his skin now seemed marble pale, and an oppressive aura emanated from his body. I exist. His voice was alien, deep, like a whisper of many voices at once. I've become what I was meant to be. Natasha shook her head. That's not true. You're our friend. You're not. You're not. I am the blood. Artyom interrupted her. The blood that rules this place. The blood that calls. Suddenly the ground beneath Natasha and Dima's feet trembled. Scarlet streams flowed from the cracks, as if the earth itself was bleeding. You came to me. Now you are part of it. Natasha grabbed Dima's arm sharply and rushed away, but Artyom only raised his palm, and an invisible force knocked them to the ground. They fell to the frozen ground, panting. You can't leave. Dima clenched his fists. If you still remember us, if there's anything left of the real Artyom, let us go. Silence. For a moment, doubt flashed in Artyom's eyes. There was still a struggle inside him. We are your friends, Natasha whispered. Artyom closed his eyes. The whispering in the air stopped. The ground stopped shaking. Go away, he said at last. What? Dima blinked, not believing his ears. I'm not who I was anymore, but I can still give you a chance. Leave now, while you still have the chance. Natasha sobbed, but nodded. Thank you. Artyom didn't answer. Dima helped Natasha up, and they rushed towards the road, to where the real world was waiting for them. Artyom looked after them. The ground shook again. He picked up the book that still lay at his feet. The bloody letters disappeared, giving way to new words. You have chosen. You are now a guardian. Artyom exhaled. He knew he would never leave this place again. He knew he was now a part of it. The mansion reappeared behind him as if it had never disappeared. He turned around and walked inside. The doors slammed shut. Epilogue. A year had passed. Natasha and Dima didn't talk about that night anymore. They moved to another city, trying to forget. But sometimes, in the complete silence, Natasha would hear a faint whisper. Blood remembers. She knew it wasn't a dream. She knew Artyom was still there, and he was waiting.